"Your father left you nothing, Olivia, because there was nothing to leave." Linda's voice dripped with false sympathy as she adjusted her new diamond tennis bracelet, the one she'd bought just 3 days after Dad's funeral. And I remember standing there in my scrubs, exhausted from a 12-hour shift at the children's hospital, feeling something crack inside me like ice breaking on a frozen lake, because those words didn't match the guilty flicker in her eyes, or the way my half-brother Marcus suddenly became very interested in his phone. And that was the moment, that exact moment 4 months ago, when I knew they were lying to me about everything. I was 36 years old, and had spent the last 8 years as a pediatric nurse, working nights and weekends to pay off my nursing school loans, while sending Dad money whenever his Social Security check ran short, which seemed to happen more and more frequently, and Linda always made sure to mention how generous it was of her to let him live in her house, the same house where I'd grown up before she arrived with her 2 kids, and slowly pushed me out, first from my bedroom, then from family dinners, and finally from any meaningful place in my father's life. Though he'd call me late at night when she was asleep, whispering that he missed me and was proud of the woman I'd become. The pattern had been established long before that funeral day confrontation. I was the daughter from the first marriage, the reminder of Dad's life before Linda, the one who inherited her mother's plain features, as Linda liked to point out at family gatherings I was rarely invited to, while Marcus and Chloe, her children from her previous marriage, were welcomed as Dad's real family, getting cars for their birthdays and college tuition paid in full, while I worked 3 jobs to get through nursing school. But I told myself it didn't matter because I had Dad's love, even if it had to be expressed in secret phone calls and coffee meetings Linda didn't know about. What I didn't know then, standing in that living room with my stepmother's pitying smile cutting deeper than any blade, was that everything I believed about my father's finances, about his dependence on Linda's generosity, about my place as the forgotten daughter who deserved nothing, was built on a foundation of lies so elaborate that when the truth finally surfaced, it would destroy everything they'd spent 15 years constructing. The pattern of my exclusion had started subtly when I was 21, and Linda first moved in with her designer luggage and her 2 teenagers, transforming our modest home into her personal kingdom where I became an unwelcome guest. And I remember the first family vacation I wasn't invited to. How Dad called me from the airport bathroom whispering apologies while Linda booked first-class tickets with money he supposedly didn't have. But I was too young and too desperate for any scrap of his attention to question the contradictions, like how a man living on Social Security could afford Marcus's BMW or Chloe's spring break trips to Cancun. Those glaring inconsistencies I trained myself to ignore because acknowledging them meant admitting my father was choosing them over me every single day. Year after year, the exclusions became more elaborate and more cruel, like the Christmas when I arrived with gifts to find they'd already opened presents hours earlier, Linda explaining with practiced innocence that they thought I had to work, even though I'd requested the day off months in advance, or my father's 70th birthday party that I discovered through Chloe's Instagram stories, seeing my dad surrounded by Linda's extended family in a private dining room at the most expensive steakhouse in the city, while I sat alone in my apartment eating leftover hospital cafeteria food, wondering how a man who needed my help with groceries could afford such extravagance. And the worst part was calling him later and hearing him lie about having a quiet evening at home when I could hear champagne glasses clinking in the background. The financial contradictions were everywhere if I'd been willing to see them. Linda's new car every 2 years while complaining about the cost of Dad's medications, the kitchen renovation that appeared overnight despite Dad's supposed poverty, the way my half-siblings never worked but always had money, and through it all, I kept sending Dad $800 every month because Linda would call with trembling voice about overdue bills and empty refrigerators, playing on my guilt as a daughter who'd abandoned him for my career, even though I'd only moved 20 minutes away, and begged for more time with him constantly, scheduling my shifts around his availability, only to be told last minute that he was too tired when I knew Linda had made other plans. What hurt most wasn't the money or the missed celebrations, but the way they made me doubt my own worth. Linda's subtle comments about how I'd inherited my mother's unfortunate metabolism and plain face, while Chloe modeled designer clothes Dad somehow afforded, or how Marcus would smirk when introducing me as his half-sister the nurse, with emphasis that made my profession sound like failure. And Dad would sit there in silence, his eyes apologetic, but his voice never rising to defend me, trapped in whatever web Linda had woven around him that I was too blind or too hopeful to understand, until I started believing maybe I really was the daughter who deserved nothing. The call came at 3 in the morning, exactly 4 months after Dad's funeral. my phone lighting up the darkness of my tiny apartment. And when I heard Linda's slurred voice telling me I needed to come get my worthless junk from Dad's old study before they converted it into Chloe's meditation room, something primal and protective surged through me, because that study was the only space in the house that still held pieces of the father I remembered from before Linda's arrival. So I threw on yesterday's scrubs and drove through empty streets, my hands shaking not from cold, but from the sudden terrible certainty that this was my last chance to salvage anything of his memory before they erased him completely. The house was dark when I arrived, using my old key that Linda didn't know I still had, and I crept through hallways that had once been my home, but now felt like enemy territory, past the formal living room where family photos displayed Linda's children at various milestones while every trace of my existence had been relegated to boxes in the basement, if they kept them at all, and when I finally reached Dad's study, the moonlight through dusty windows illuminated a chaos of half-packed boxes and scattered papers, like vultures had already been picking through his belongings, searching for anything valuable they might have missed. I started gathering what I could, his old coffee-stained notebooks filled with his precise handwriting, the wooden letter opener I'd given him for Father's Day when I was 12, photographs from his first marriage to my mother that Linda had banished here. And it was while reaching for a box on the highest shelf, standing on the same rickety chair he'd refused to replace for 20 years, that everything changed, because my hand knocked against something solid hidden behind dusty tax returns, a metal box that had been deliberately pushed to the very back, covered by a cloth that made it invisible unless you were looking for it, and my heart stopped as I recognized Dad's careful concealment, the same way he used to hide my birthday presents when I was little. Inside that box, wrapped in plastic like he was protecting evidence for a trial, I found bank statements I'd never seen before, account numbers that didn't match anything Linda had shown me when she was crying about their poverty, and as my shaking fingers traced the numbers, the deposits and balances that made no sense, I saw document after document with Dad's signature showing regular deposits into accounts at 3 different banks, accounts with balances that made my monthly assistance look like pocket change, and underneath it all, a single sticky note in Dad's handwriting that said simply, "For Olivia, they don't know about these." And suddenly every contradiction, every lie, every moment of confusion crystallized into a truth so shocking that I had to sit down on his old chair to keep from collapsing. Because my father, the man I'd been supporting, the man Linda claimed was a burden living on her charity, had been wealthy all along. My hands trembled as I photographed every page with my phone, the flash cutting through darkness like truth through years of deception, and at the bottom of the box I found the most damning evidence of all. A business registration showing Dad as sole owner of a property management company I'd never heard of, rental agreements for commercial buildings downtown, and investment account statements that showed he'd been quietly accumulating wealth for decades while Linda played the generous wife supporting a poor old man. And I realized with growing horror that every dollar I'd sent, every sacrifice I'd made thinking I was helping him survive, had been part of some elaborate charade I couldn't yet understand. I left that house at dawn with the metal box hidden under my scrubs like a beating heart full of secrets. And for the next 3 weeks I became someone I didn't recognize, a detective in my own life, spending every moment between shifts at the hospital diving deeper into the paper trail my father had left behind, calling banks with trembling voice to verify accounts, visiting the county clerk's office during lunch breaks to trace property records. And what emerged wasn't just wealth but an empire built so quietly that even Linda, for all her greed, had only glimpsed the tip of it, living off the crumbs while sitting on a gold mine she didn't know existed. The first breakthrough came when I visited Commerce Bank downtown, where a kind manager named Janet recognized Dad's name and her face softened with genuine sadness as she said, "He was one of our most discreet clients, always paid in cash, never wanted anyone to know his business." And when she pulled up his accounts, showing me balances that made my knees weak, she mentioned something that changed everything. He came in just 6 months ago to update beneficiaries on everything, said he wanted to make sure the right person inherited what he'd built. And I knew with absolute certainty that he'd been planning for this moment, preparing for a war Linda didn't know was coming. Every night after my shifts, I'd spread the documents across my tiny kitchen table like a general planning a campaign, creating spreadsheets that tracked property ownership, photographing every receipt and contract, and the scope of what I discovered stole my breath. Dad owned the strip mall where Linda bought her groceries, the office building where Marcus pretended to work at his friend's company, even the boutique where Chloe spent thousands on clothes, and they had no idea their entire lifestyle was built on property owned by the man they'd dismissed as a charity case, paying rent that went into accounts they didn't know existed. The hardest part was maintaining the facade of the grieving, naive daughter while gathering ammunition, like when Linda called asking for help with the astronomical property taxes on the house, crying about how she might have to sell her home, and I bit my tongue until it bled to keep from revealing that I'd found the deed showing Dad had transferred the house to a trust just months before his death. A trust with very specific instructions she clearly hadn't discovered, so I sent her $2,000 while documenting every manipulative text and voicemail, building a case that would destroy her fabricated widow's tale. By the 4th week, I had everything. Proof of the hidden accounts Linda had tried to claim didn't exist. Documentation showing she'd attempted to forge Dad's signature on several documents after his death. Evidence that Marcus and Chloe had been receiving monthly payments from Dad's business accounts, while I'd been sending my hard-earned money thinking he was destitute. And most damning of all, a safety deposit box at a third bank containing Dad's real will, properly notarized and witnessed, that painted a very different picture from the document Linda had produced at the funeral, the one that conveniently left everything to her. The call from Dad's estate lawyer came on a Tuesday morning while I was checking on a 6-year-old recovering from surgery, and when Robert Castellano's secretary said he urgently needed to discuss irregularities in the estate filing, I knew the moment had arrived to stop being the victim in Linda's narrative and become the author of my own justice. So I scheduled the meeting for my next day off, spending the intervening hours organizing my evidence into a presentation that would leave no room for doubt, no space for Linda's tears to wash away the truth of what she'd tried to steal from me. I arrived at Castellano's office carrying 2 banker's boxes of documents, my hands steady now with purpose instead of trembling with grief. And when he saw the real will I'd found in Dad's safety deposit box, his face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation weren't so devastating. Surprise, then understanding, then a professional anger that made him lean forward and say, "Your father was my client for 15 years, and I can assure you the will Mrs. Patterson filed with the court was not the one I prepared. And I knew I'd found my first ally in this war I'd never wanted but couldn't afford to lose." The next 3 weeks became a chess game where I moved pieces Linda didn't even know were on the board, starting with quiet visits to each of Dad's rental properties where I introduced myself to tenants as the new owner, showing them documentation that made their eyes widen. And at the strip mall, the property manager Harold nearly cried when I told him who I was, saying, "Your father talked about you constantly, said you were the only one who never asked him for anything, just loved him for who he was, and he handed me a box of keys I didn't know existed, including one to an office Linda had never seen where Dad had kept the real books for his business empire." That office became my war room, and what I found there made everything else pale in comparison. Detailed records showing Linda had been siphoning money from Dad's accounts for years, transferring funds to accounts in Marcus and Chloe's names, documentation of her attempts to pressure Dad to change his will during his final months when dementia made him vulnerable, and most shocking of all, a series of recordings Dad had made on an old digital recorder, his voice shaky but clear as he stated for the record that he was being coerced, that Linda threatened to keep me away if he didn't comply, that he was hiding assets to ensure I got what my mother would have wanted me to have. The final piece fell into place when I hired a forensic accountant recommended by Castellano, a woman named Patricia who specialized in elder financial abuse cases, and after reviewing everything, she looked at me with something between admiration and sympathy, saying, "Your father was playing a longer game than any of them realized, creating a paper trail that would protect you even after he was gone." And she showed me how he'd structured his holdings, so that even if Linda got the house and the visible assets, the real wealth remained untouchable, waiting for someone with the legal standing to claim it, waiting for me to finally understand that every secret meeting, every whispered phone call, every hidden document was his way of ensuring that love, not greed, would ultimately prevail. The morning of the confrontation arrived with spring rain pattering against my apartment windows, and I dressed carefully in my best professional outfit, not the scrubs Linda always saw me in, but the woman I'd become despite her best efforts to diminish me. And when I walked into Robert Castellano's conference room where Linda sat with Marcus and Chloe, their lawyer looking uncomfortable as he shuffled papers he must have known were worthless, I saw the exact moment their confidence cracked, when Castellano placed the real will on the table alongside the forensic accountant's report, and Linda's perfectly manicured hand trembled as she reached for the document that would destroy everything she thought she'd stolen. "This is impossible," Linda whispered, her voice losing its usual honey-coated manipulation as she read Dad's actual words, the ones that left the house in trust for me with her as merely a temporary resident who could be evicted at the trustee's discretion, which happened to be me. And then Castellano began laying out document after document, the property deeds, the business registrations, the bank accounts she'd never known existed, and with each revelation, I watched 15 years of lies crumble like tissue paper in rain, while Marcus kept saying, "But Mom said there was nothing," as if repeating the lie could make it true again. The moment that broke them completely came when Patricia, the forensic accountant, presented her findings in a voice devoid of emotion, but heavy with implications. Mrs. Patterson illegally transferred $1,000 from Mr. Patterson's accounts over the past 5 years, funds that were moved without proper authorization, to accounts belonging to Marcus and Chloe Patterson. And she showed the paper trail on the conference room screen, each transaction highlighted and documented, while I sat silently, letting the evidence speak louder than any accusation I could make, watching Chloe's designer bag slip from her nerveless fingers as she realized those shopping sprees had been funded by theft. "We can explain," Linda started, but Castellano cut her off with raised hand, producing the most damning evidence of all, Dad's recordings, and when his voice filled the room, shaky with age but clear with purpose, saying, "I'm making this recording on March 15th because my wife Linda is pressuring me to change my will, threatening to keep Olivia away if I don't comply. But I wanted on record that my daughter Olivia is my sole intended heir, that the properties and businesses I've built were always meant for her, the only one who loved me without asking for anything in return." I saw Linda's face drain of all color, her carefully constructed facade of the devoted widow shattering completely. The negotiations that followed were swift and merciless, because Linda knew that criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud would destroy not just her reputation, but result in actual prison time. So when Castellano presented my terms, complete vacation of the house within 30 days, return of all stolen funds, and relinquishment of any claim to Dad's estate, she signed with shaking hands while Marcus muttered about unfairness, and Chloe cried about losing her boutique job, not yet understanding that I owned the building where she worked, that I controlled the commercial leases their entire social circle depended upon, that the woman they'd dismissed as just a nurse now held their futures in her hands with the same care they'd shown for my feelings. Absolutely none. 6 months have passed since that morning in the conference room, and I'm writing this from Dad's study, though it's my study now, surrounded by his books and the faint scent of his cologne that still lingers. And sometimes I catch myself smiling when Linda's car pulls into the grocery store parking lot where she unknowingly pays rent to me, because I kept Harold as property manager, letting him be the face while I remain the silent owner Dad trained me to be, turning their greed into nursing scholarships for students who need someone to believe in them. The house feels different now, lighter somehow, filled with photographs Linda had hidden in the basement, my mother smiling from frames that once again line the mantelpiece. And I've kept my nursing job because that's who I am beneath the property deeds and bank accounts, though now I work part-time, using the freedom to volunteer at the free clinic downtown, telling colleagues I received a small inheritance, letting them imagine thousands rather than millions, because Dad taught me that real power comes from being underestimated. Marcus still texts occasionally, alternating between rage and pleading, not understanding why the building where he pretended to work won't renew leases for tenants with fraud convictions, and Chloe discovered her boutique closed when the lease expired, though I made sure both received exactly what Dad's will specified. Nothing more than what they'd already stolen, nothing less than what the law required, which was beautifully, perfectly, nothing at all. There's no anger left now, just profound peace when I approve leases for people who treat others with respect, when I fund scholarships for exhausted nursing students, when I realize Dad spent 15 years protecting not just property, but the chance for his daughter to discover she was never the forgotten one, never the unworthy one, but the only one he trusted with everything that mattered, the one who inherited not just his empire but his patience, his strategy, and his unshakable belief that love, quiet and strategic, always wins in the end.